Okay, great. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to all of you, to be with two good friends, my fellow panelists who are great. And I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say very, very much. They have some great things to say. Uh, I want to approach this from a human scale, if I could. And I want you to ask yourself, when it comes to adoption, what it would mean to do it humanely, what it would mean if we had the so-called global village and we were dealing with people who respected and knew each other. And I think one of the fundamental things that would be true in a situation like that is that we would ensure that adoption, and especially international adoption, was really necessary, that there weren't other measures that could preserve the family or preserve the tie of that child to their own heritage, nation, and place and people, whatever that may be. Unfortunately, and I think it's up on the sidebar there, I'm going to be speaking about moratoria because unfortunately it is my view, having researched this for many, many years, that the majority of adoptions over the last 70 years, from 1950 to 2020, have occurred through international adoption systems where that basic tenet that this was necessary, this great break between the child and their family and the child and their heritage was truly necessary. And in fact, chronically, children have arrived in international adoption for 70 years through adoption systems that chronically violate what we call international standards today. And I'm going to talk about those international standards, but if you reduce them to their human scale, comes down to that simple question: what would they be doing? Would they be taking the child? Would they be helping them financially? Would somebody else be sorting out some other issue there in their home country? Would this be what you would do for another human being, is to take their child under the particular circumstances? Now, the international standards that have been violated chronically, and they vary from country to country and from time to time, there's no single thing, are the following. Number one, the prohibition of the abduction, the sale, and traffic in children. And this I've translated to, for international adoption purposes, to the concept of child laundering. Concept of child laundering is a particular non-legal, unethical adoption practice where children are first wrongly obtained from their original family by force, fraud, or funds. And by force, fraud, or funds, I mean essentially kidnapping, buying, and fraud usually means tricking them out of their kids. Basically telling them that this is a temporary arrangement or an arrangement for a boarding school type situation, or to provide certain services to the child, when in fact the goal is to completely sever the parent-child relationship. And so first you obtain the child by force, fraud, or funds, and then you make the child what is often called a paper orphan, which means that you make them adoptable. And then the thing that's so tricky about these unethical, non-legal adoption practices is that they look legal. That's where the concept laundering comes from. Once the child has been labeled an orphan eligible for adoption, they're processed through the official intercountry adoption system. They're not snuck across the border. It looks like it's not a gang or a smuggling operation. It looks like a bunch of well-intentioned official interactions with passports and so forth. So that's one kind of violation. And I have documented this again and again. And again, I'm going to be talking here for a short period of time. I think it may be up on the side there on the left, but what you see there is a link to my BE Press site, which you can also find by just Googling my name, which is in front of you, Smolin, kind of an odd name, I know, but Smolin, and the term BE Press, BEPRESS, and then all those articles are available free for download. So there's the general set of like 20 or 30 articles. I don't know, Tricia, how many are there? But seeing you up there, it's good to see you. Glad that you made it. And then there is the particular one on moratoria that I'm trying to talk about today, which is the most recent one. Now, the other kinds of unethical adoption practices that have permeated intercountry adoption for 70 years relate to poverty. It has been considered normal for adoptive parents from wealthier countries like Australia and the US and also Europe to, through intermediaries, go to developing nations and obtain the desperate, obtain children from desperately poor families. And that's been treated as normal. Tricia's nodding. I mean, you've seen this, you've done field work. And it just bothers me so much. I cannot express how much it bothers me. And that's why I want to turn this into a human interaction, because this has been normalized again and again, the idea that we're helping the poor. And what I want you to do as you think about this, of course, Trish and also Lynelle know this very well, but those others listening, is I want you to think about putting the shoe on the other foot. If you yourself were poor, would this be an act of goodwill to say, I won't help your family stay together, but I'll take your child halfway across the world and you'll never see them again? Is that an act of kindness? Is that an act of goodwill? And unfortunately, this has been so normalized in intercountry adoption that even though it's officially against international standards, operationally, when you go to an official agency, even a pretty good agency, if they're operating in certain countries, they've just accepted this, okay? Another standard that's been normalized in a lot of places has to do with the situation of the single or non-married mother who doesn't have a partner to assist her. And in many systems like the South Korean system, and in also Australia historically for domestic adoption, of course, Australia has and Trish, Lynelle, you can talk more about this since you all are closer, but Australia has apologized, as I understand it, about their own treatment of the single mother, okay? But then you go on and you go to a country like South Korea and you treat that as normal, even if you no longer treat it as normal in your own country. That essentially we don't treat a single parent and a child as a family unit that we want to try to preserve, but we use that as a grounds of adoptability, that we can take this child. And there's so much social pressure, and that's another thing that finally violates international standards today and has been so common. Another international standard beyond child laundering, poverty, single parents, has been this problem of what adoption is and the confusion about that, which has opened the door to so much fraud. The basic thing is that international adoption has favored what I'll call the full adoption system that treats the adopted child as having no relationship to their original family, to their parents, their grandparents, uncles, aunts, siblings who are not adopted with them, anybody. They are legal strangers. It's as though it is as if, and that's what I call it, as if they were born to the adoptive family. And that did have a positive goal to make them fully in the adoptive family, so there would be no discrimination against them once they're in their new situation. And I do understand that positive goal, but it has two or three major problems. One problem is that in much of the world, that concept, even if it's on the law books or if it's not on the law books, either way, is just not well understood in the among the populations that are targeted for intercountry adoption. They just don't believe that you can pick up a pen, piece of paper, sign something, and they may not even be literate, or they may be literate to a third grade thing, and they have no conception, even if it's told to them, which it often is not, of course, but even if goodwill people try to tell them this means, such and such, it just doesn't make any sense to them. Now, I suggest that they're wrong. I mean, that we're wrong and they're right about that. I don't think it makes sense, the model of full severance adoption. And, again, Tricia comes from a social work background. Lynelle can talk about this from an adoptee background, but the notion that it doesn't matter who you were born to, that we can just erase that, and it won't matter to the people who gave birth to that child, the people in the broader sense that they came from, that it won't matter to the child when they grow up. This legal fiction, as we call it, and I am a lawyer and a law professor, is a real problem because it doesn't square with social and psychological realities for communities and for the individuals impacted by this. Now, that's one huge problem. In terms of international standards, the part of it that still violates that is when the birth parents sign something that they do not understand. And that they're not really relinquishing their children. Now, what this means at the adoptive parent side, unfortunately, if you are somebody listening to this who's thinking about adopting, is that no matter how kind and ethical and good-hearted the people you're dealing with in your country, Australia, the US, idealistic, whatever it may be, if they're unable to fully connect to people in the other country who are fully ethical and who have a motivation to make sure that this gets done correctly, it will not get done correctly. So if you're in a context where in the other country, it's just normal to take poor kids for, they're gonna take poor kids. And no matter what your people tell you about that particular system, it just won't be true. And if you're used to a context where a single mother is supported and you expect the same thing to be done where you're adopting from, you cannot take that for granted. Now, there are several reasons that's true. One reason that's true is, unfortunately, there's a financial incentive that distorts adoption, child welfare, all these areas. Essentially, there are all these intermediaries who are going to get 10, 20 times more if they steer a child towards intercountry adoption than they would get if they steered a child towards family preservation or an in-country option. So that naturally distorts things. Secondly, there is often a power and cultural imbalance within the other countries that we, coming from Australia or the US, cannot really affect. So the person, even if they're not motivated by money that we're dealing with in the other country and they're idealistic by their own terms, may have a tendency to look down upon the poor populations from which they are taking children. I mean, I had a Catholic nun was quoted to me as saying, I took the child from a bad mother and gave the child to a good mother because of the situation of that person as a single mother, different faith, and so forth. And whether she got money or not, she thought she was doing the right thing, but that's just not the right thing to take a child from a vulnerable mother because you look down upon their particular setting. But unfortunately, it's not just a matter of our relationships to other countries, it's the relationships and the power imbalances within the other countries that we, coming from Australia or the US, are pretty powerless to impact. And then I'm trying to watch my time here. Please feel free to signal me for now or Trish, but I think I've got about 8 or 9 minutes left. I think that one of the other things that's been so problematic when you talk about international standards has been, okay, we've got these standards. Some kids who come through them are properly adopted, some are not, but we don't know because they've come through these systems that have not differentiated between the children who, if you applied international standards, would be adoptable and the ones that would not. The systems just are not reliable. And then you land up in another country with a child. And then, of course, there's every motivation to not look into it. Adoptive parents don't want to necessarily know this. And here's the kicker. Even if an adoptive parent is the kind of person who says, I'm going to dig into this, and they find out that something was done wrong, and they want to do something about it while the child is still young and a child, and they've got people helping them in the other country, and there are definitely cases like this. Nobody wants to help them. The governments don't care. There's no regulator of international adoption. There are treaties, but those treaty bodies are not regulators. They don't delve into individual cases, okay? And so essentially, and this is in my article, and I don't want to highlight my personal background too much, but what I discovered as an adoptive parent of children wrongfully taken from their original family, what my wife and I discovered over time is that none of the governments involved cared. I could be sitting there with, in essence, a kidnapped child, and nobody wanted my wife or I to do anything about that. In fact, they were urging us not to, and the adoption community was urging us not to. And so there's been a chronic lack of remedies when things are done wrong, which means there's impunity. And you cannot operate a system as delicate, as subject to well-intentioned or bad-intentioned actors as intercountry adoption and not have remedies for when it goes wrong. It would be like flying planes, and when they crash, Well, we don't want to know about that. We'll just keep flying it in the same way. We have no interest in knowing why the plane crashed. In fact, it's not treated as a plane crash, it's treated as a celebration. It's great, a child was adopted, let's celebrate that. And then there's this invisibility of the family back in the other country that's lost their children. I know I'm painting a very dire picture, and that's deliberate. And I'm not saying that every child who comes through the system meets these dire circumstances, but I'm saying that it's been chronic from most countries to most countries for the last 3 years. And the chronic lack of remedies has been very real. Now, I think I started at 7:20. I've got 16 minutes. I was told 20. I just re-verified that. So I want to try to close and talk about this notion of a moratoria that I put forward in this article, which you're free to read. I know it's controversial, stopping intercountry adoption, will that harm children? And my basic answer is more children would be helped than harmed, number one. Okay, the fundamental problem that we have here is, first of all, intercountry adoption is very rare. And it was very rare when the numbers were large. The numbers are down by over 80% before COVID-19. After COVID-19, I presume they'll be down 90-something%. So there are very few children passing through the system before COVID, even less now. Compared to the children who are vulnerable in, quote, alternative care, meaning some kind of out-of-family care setting, of which we think, again, from the articles I've seen, estimated 3, 4, 5 million, okay? And so shutting down this system in terms of stopping children from moving might impact 10,000 children over the next year or two if we did a moratoria right now. Now, and in Australia, from what I was told, Lynelle, thank you, the numbers are so small that it would impact very few children. And I will say, by the way, I know there's some expat adoption issues. My moratoria call does not deal with two situations. One is if you're an expat and you go through the domestic adoption system of another country, I'm not dealing with that. Secondly, intercountry adoptions that are basically intra-family transfers of children across country lines, they're always with their extended family. I'm not dealing with that when I propose moratoria, okay? When I propose moratoria, I'm saying we've got to stop the system now while it's small, and we've got to see if we can provide remedies for the last 70 years. And we can create systems to provide remedies for the last 70 years. Systems for adoptees, systems for first family, systems for also adoptive families that were wronged by this. And if we discover we cannot supply remedies for when it goes wrong, we should not reopen. If we have a moment where we discover that we can actually supply remedies, then we need to start to do what we haven't done in 70 years, which is take that seriously. And then once we've seen what that heartbreak is like up close, what it's like when you reunite people across these country lines who have missed 2 years, 5 years, 20 years, 30 years with their family, what it does to an adoptive family to discover their child was not an orphan, what it does to all these families. Once we've seen that, then we can decide whether this system is worth it, keeping in mind that this system only touches a very small proportion of children in need at best. The other aspect, real quick, is that intercountry adoption systems harm a lot of children who are never at all adopted, because there's this demand pull coming from the US, France, Italy, Netherlands, Australia. And this demand pull results in children getting pulled into orphanage situations wrongfully to be almost a kind of like portfolio to choose from for adoptive families. And a lot of those kids who get pulled into orphanages wrongly because of the demand pull of intercountry adoption are never adopted anyway. So from that point of view, I think, we need to take a pause here. And with that statement that we need to take a pause here, I will stop and see what my co-panelists have to say. First of all, we need to take the money out of it. And for the US, that's a huge issue. And about half the kids, now down to 40%, come to the US, and the US offers too much money in an unrestrained way. Second, we need to take the demand pressure, whether it's money or not. Countries that try to operate good systems, and some of the countries do now, some of the origin countries do, should not feel pressured to come up with kids for other parts of the world. So you got to get rid of the demand pressure, number one. Number two, you have to have these remedies in place for when it goes wrong. So if those remedies aren't in place, you can't do it right. Number three, obviously what I'm saying is you follow these international standards, not just in a procedural theoretical sense, we jump through the Hague hoops. And I'm not trying to belittle the Hague hoops. I work with those people, they're good people, but it's not enough to jump through the Hague hoops. It must actually be true that children are not coming because of poverty, because their mothers are, not married, because they didn't understand full severance adoption. So we have to make sure those things are actually true. In other words, we have to make sure that where I began, in a humane world, if these were all people who knew each other, it would be a humane thing to transport this child.
It is complicated, like everything else about adoption. It depends on what country you're talking about. So if you're talking about the countries of origin, we might and most likely be talking about unqualified workers who are community workers or women in the village who's taken on those welfare roles. And they work very hard but have minimal training, and that is an issue, and probably not much funding in most places. And in village settings as well, again, depending upon the country, sometimes it's village leaders who make those decisions. But of course, when we're talking about countries like Australia, where there's qualified social workers work at all levels, from research, policy to direct practice, which is about processing, education of prospective adoptive parents, conducting home studies, assessments, following up after a child has been adopted, so every level really we have social workers, but also things have been diluted a bit in Australia where other disciplines who may have different training are now doing some of those tasks. And I think it's really important, and David touched on some of this, that there's a lot of discourses around adoption, and some are based on evidence and some aren't. And social work is a value-based profession. So it's about commitments to human rights and child rights and social justice and critical evaluation of evidence as it presents and practices and policies and systems. So all of those factors are relevant. Yes, there is, and David certainly touched on this. It's about poverty. The majority of children have at least one parent and kin. And what's inadequate in most countries is tracing, reunification, because children get separated. Children are put in residential care institutions for the short term. There's very little effort often in family strengthening and addressing those issues. And again, it varies from country to country. And where you get adoption agencies operating, you get a proliferation of orphanages, which in itself is abusive for children. So The minute an adoption agency goes in, particularly in private systems, you will see the growth of residential care institutions. Even the best programs, one thing we know from many, many adoptees, and I'm sure Lynelle will expand on this, is that very often, in fact a lot, the circumstances of relinquishment stories are totally inaccurate. And that is a problem. And that is a big marker of an issue, because in a lot of countries, you know, we will get documentation with fingerprints and there's no verification that people often relinquishing a child are the parents of that child. And baby shoots, wherever they exist, are a big, big problem. And of course, none of this is denigrating adoptive parenthood and saying adoption is wrong, but there are issues with inter-country adoption. And I think the reality is most countries, developing countries who are countries of origin for children, are developing their own child protection systems. And that's why we're seeing an international decrease in numbers. And that's actually a good thing, because there are losses associated with the process. It's not a wholly positive process. So, as countries are developing systems such as family strengthening, tracing and reunification methods, developing foster care and developing domestic adoption as well for those children who are in need. So, so it's not necessarily a desirable thing. Yeah, as David said, it's the wealthier countries, it's the wealthy in countries, and certainly North America, Europe, Australia too, certainly in lesser numbers. And the next question is which countries are sending their children, and that they tend to be developing countries. As doors close, as countries become regulated, the demand shifts to more unregulated countries. And so where there are very poor welfare systems, where there is pressure, and there is political pressure from lobbyists and governments who actually visit countries to engage in developing programs, and particularly when that's tied in with trade negotiations, which is that money issue. You know, how does adoption get tied into trade negotiations? And that's at the root of a lot of programs as they start. And yeah, I think that's the main issues for that question. I think there's an assumption that many of these children are abused. Some are, but when it's about poverty and separation is about poverty, or when separation is about a disability where a parent cannot access healthcare, that's not necessarily abuse. There's those systemic issues that that put children in residential care institutions. I mean, the Vietnam War, where it started with Australia, children were put in homes for safety, and when parents came back to get them, they were gone because they'd been adopted overseas and rescued. So, I mean, a lot of those conditions are still relevant today, and this is part of that ethical practice that David was talking about and the measures that you need to put in place. But you can't assume children are abused. The parents overseas are no different from us. It's just that their environmental circumstances are very different. And some parents are abusive, but the vast majority want to do the best for their children within the resources that they have. The other important factor is that children have relationships. They build relationships with their carers, even if they are in an institution, with siblings. I've watched young children grieve watching videos after adoption, pointing out all the friends that they left. You know, these are important relationships and we often forget that.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'll just let you know what the organisation is, so that helps people kind of have some context. So Intercountry Adoptee Voices is a network that I've built up throughout the world over the last 22 years. I am an intercountry adoptee, one of the first, as Patricia mentioned, from Vietnam to come to Australia. I came as a 5-month-old baby, and surprise, surprise, we don't stay babies forever. We actually grow up. We have opinions of our own, and we live the experience of being an intercountry adoptee. So I founded this organisation because of my lived experience, where I grew up in Australia, in Victoria, in a remote region. I grew up on a dairy farm with a family who had 4 other biological children. And my experience growing up was one of isolation physically from anyone who was racially my mirrors, and isolated emotionally from anyone who actually understood what on earth it was like to grow up as a minority in a majority country of white people who think of your birth country as some heathen backward country. So that kind of gives you a little bit of context of how it is for us. You know, we can talk about intercountry adoption from a very legal perspective or from a philosophical perspective, but for us, for people like me, it is our lived reality, and it's a confusing experience. It's a very isolating experience, and if we don't have other people who are like us to connect to talk about our experiences with, to have some validation from, we can end up growing up with some, you know, very challenging mental health issues. And it is an issue that I see a lot in my network, where people are struggling. Adoptees struggle. They struggle with the experience. They struggle to know how to talk about it, because mainstream media and mainstream perception is that we are so lucky. You know, but what people forget in intercountry adoption is what we lose. We lose our connections to our country, our culture, our people, our race. In situations like mine, where I was adopted without any identification papers, I didn't even know what my identity was. And it took me 43 years to actually search through Vietnam, trying to find where on earth is a piece of paper that tells me who I am and where I was born, what date I was born. So for people who don't understand this journey, you know, you somehow need to wrap your head around what is it like to grow up not knowing who you are, growing up in a family where you don't actually have anyone who looks like you, no one who you can kind of say, oh, I get this trait from my mom or my dad, no one who has the same hair, no one who has the same skin color. It's a very isolating experience for many adoptees, unless that adoptive family is really switched on, has done a lot of work and a lot of education, and has really, you know, sought out the educational material that's actually out there now. So that is why I created ICAV. It is a network of intercountry adoptees like me around the world. I basically pull together all the most outspoken, proactive leaders who run intercountry adoptee-led groups for others like themselves. We provide peer support, and we also do a lot to educate and advocate. So I initially started off my journey, you know, just kind of coming to terms with my own personal experience, which takes a good many years to kind of work through. But then as the time went on, as the years went by, and after starting to get involved in government level and speaking out at commissions and investigations and things like that, I started to realize there's a bigger picture. And in connecting to a lot of my peers around the world, I started to think a little bit more critically about what intercountry adoption is and what it means to a person like me. So we as an organisation attempt to not only provide peer support, but we also aim to educate the wider public, and we also advocate. So for example, you know, ICAV, this organisation, was invited at the recent Hague meeting in July to represent the voices of lived experience from an illicit or illegal adoption background. We provided our paper, which captured over 60 intercountry adoptee voices and organisations, their perspectives on what really needs to happen to address the poor history of our historic adoptions and what really needs to be done to actually give us some support and to recognise, you know, that enough's enough. Like, how long are we going to keep going until we eventually, you know, do something about the problems? Growing up, I've obviously talked about the feelings of isolation. The struggle with identity was huge, not knowing, you know, who I came from, not knowing about myself as a basic fact, you know, whether my birth date was correct. Struggling with identity is a huge, huge issue that we all experience. Struggling to connect back to my origins was even more difficult, because you've got to remember, back in the time in the 70s in Australia, we just came out of the White Australia policy. So there was a lot of real anti-Asian sentiment, very similar to what's happening now with coronavirus and Trump kind of speaking of Asians the way he does. So that really impacts a young child. You know, as a young child, all you want to do is just feel loved. You want to feel connected. You want to feel like you fit in. Well, you know, for me and many others, when we look so racially different to the majority around us, it's very difficult to actually develop a healthy sense of identity. I struggled with the intrusive questions that people would always ask. You know, they would hear my Aussie accent and they would just look at me dumbfounded, going, but where are you from? They're trying to piece together why my voice, my accent does not match my looks, you know, and then I get the reverse when I meet Asians. They kind of speak away at you in some Asian language, but I can only turn to them and say, sorry, I only speak English, you know, and they're like, huh, what's wrong with you? You know, so we get this all the time, where we are in between two cultures and race, where we're not fully accepted into one or the other because we don't match what we're supposed to be based on our physical appearance. And that's a very jarring reality for adoptees to deal with, especially when young. You know, much easier for me now as an older adult, because I can decide how I want to respond, and I can either make a joke or I can just decide to completely ignore them because I don't feel like going into a whole dialogue about my history, which is very personal, right? So that was some of the issues that I had. And then what most people don't think about too, in what we're seeing now as an adoptee network around the world, is the generational impact. So we have children now ourselves. My children, my daughter, for example, at 6 years old, she said to me, yeah, mummy, I would really love to know who my tummy grandma is, because we only know who my adoptive parents are, but we have no clue as to how to find my tummy mummy or who she even is. So people who adopt, they're generally doing an adoption, I guess, out of a short-term need. I want to create a family now. They're not doing it from a, let's look at this longitudinal perspective and kind of think, okay, if I adopt a child now, I'm going to be impacting multiple generations. Their whole family line gets altered forever. the family dynamic, the family story, it becomes completely changed once you pull a child out of their country and culture and move to another place. Yeah, but that took a long time, and it took me over a decade to actually come to terms with what it meant to be Vietnamese, because I had actually absorbed so much of the shame that was unspoken, but it was the experiences I'd had. So it took me a long time. I had to actively reach out to other Asian communities and people and really make a concerted effort to not hate being Asian, because that's actually how I had grown up thinking and being. And finding this, creating this network was a huge part of actually absorbing back and re-embracing back a positive sense of identity in my Asian heritage. Having other adoptees, especially Asian adoptees, who I could relate to, where they struggle and share the same issues, talking to them about how they deal with it and how they re-embrace, their identity. So often for us, it means returning to our country of origin, really exploring our adoption and what it means, and actively trying to connect back into Asian communities or whatever birth country you come from. So for me, I kind of did it in a big way, I guess, because I've actually married into an Asian family, which was, just such a shock to me, because all my life I was like, no, I'm only dating white guys, because that's what I had been absorbed and I had been surrounded with, white is beautiful. So that's what I thought I was meant to do. And it took my poor husband, took him 3 years of persisting, of being my friend, until I finally overcame that deep sense of shame to actually realize that, you know what, being Asian is actually pretty cool and can be sexy, can be great, can be a great material, marriage material, So it took me a long time to shift out of that, but I have fully embraced my heritage, and I love the fact that I can raise my children with everything I didn't have, and that is to surround them with their culture and country and people who mirror them, who are their tribe. And I think that's so important for people to remember, that if you adopt a child from a foreign country, you have to go to the nth degree to help your child be surrounded by their mirrors. You can't expect them to grow up with a healthy sense of identity if you just completely throw them into a, completely different culture and race and environment. Yeah. Yeah, so some of the advice I would say, and I know David alluded to the fact that The Hague is not the be all and end all, but definitely following an adoption in Australia that is done under the central authorities who are a signatory of The Hague is definitely a better way and a better route for an adoption of a child than to adopt a child through a non-Hague country or through your own private adoption arrangements. Those private adoption arrangements is often how we get many, many problems. So for example, you would have heard in the media in Australia in the last couple of years, some problems where Australian parents are having trouble bringing their children back in who were adopted from an overseas country but are not eligible to enter Australia as an Australian citizen because their adoption was done privately, not through the Hague Convention. And so there's all these questions about, well, how ethical was that adoption? The other thing I recommend is learn from lived experience, and that's learning from people like myself, listening to adult adoptees. We have so much out there in terms of on the media, social media, for prospective parents and adoptive families to learn from, question. When you're going through that adoption process, if you have a hunch that something's not quite right, if you're being asked for money that doesn't sound right, you're probably right. It isn't right? So money will always make things dubious and unethical. So you've got to question and follow your gut. Don't just listen to an adoption agency with blind admiration and respect. They are in it for a business. They're not in it for the child. They're in it for their business. Find out and ask, what other options has your child been offered before being made available for adoption abroad? That's a huge one that I think many adoptive parents fail to actually look at and probably don't know unless someone tells them. The other thing to consider is, you do have to be prepared for worst case scenario. What if your child who you've been pining for, having this dream life about, what if your child arrives and doesn't actually bond with you? That is such a common scenario that adoptive parents are just not equipped and prepared to deal with unless they've gone through extensive training, education, and really, deep diving psychologically into their own issues. So the other thing is learn about race, culture, heritage before you go adopting a child from abroad. I always challenge adoptive parents who are thinking about adopting, and I say, why is it that you have to adopt them and bring them here? If you're that keen on helping a child go to their country, live there, raise the child there and give them everything there, but don't remove them from their country, culture, and race, because that in fact adds and multiplies all the losses and all the trauma and all the grief that they have to live with for the rest of their life. And the last thing is to just make sure that if you are adopting, adopt to a country that actually provides adequate post-adoption support. And here's where I say that a lot of countries are pretty unethical in adopting children because they do it in a way that considers adoption as a one-stop transaction. Let's just adopt a child in and then everything's hunky-dory. What they fail to do is realise and recognise that adoption is a lifelong journey. We suffer many, many challenges and issues, much more than the average born-to child. And if a country does not provide adequate post-adoption support, they're really ultimately setting up families and children for failure and for trauma and for lifelong complications that are unnecessary. So they're the biggest tips that I have for people who are considering adopting. I definitely think that it's definitely, yes, a better option. I definitely prefer, children to stay with same race, if possible. But I just say that, expecting a child to go through a transition of being in one country to another, you got to remember that language can be completely different. Smells, food, all of these sensory things can be so different. So what they do is they add and compound to a child's trauma when you uplift them out of where they're used to a completely different place, like just toileting, for example. How different are the toilets in Western civilized countries compared to our poverty-stricken countries? And if a child can't actually speak our language, that's just, you're setting them up for like just being bound in a box until they learn the language of the adoptive parents. They cannot communicate. And for a child, that's so much trauma. So these are the issues that, adoptive parents they need to think through before they actually, set out on this path.
Well, I must say I've enjoyed the speakers today immensely. I have been involved with several sessions from the RBA conference in Tokyo on intercountry adoptions and Hague Conventions, and I have seen things that have gone wrong. Of course, Australia offers the adoption visa subclass, which we have 4 different types of adoption processes, which one is the expatriate private overseas adoption, the state or territory arranged adoptions, the Hague Convention adoptions, and the third party adoption conventions. The practice has had experience with a lot of expatriate private adoptions, which can cause problems where adoptee parents live in the home country for at least 12 months. There are lots of loops to go through in these circumstances, and they do cause a lot of problems if things go wrong. But I take David's point. I mean, should we really be doing this? Should we really be progressing with this type of adoption process? Because there is a lot of money in it. It reminds me on another scale of the modern slavery issues that I've been dealing with and have been quite spoken about with the child trafficking and those types of things, and the orphanage tourism. So where there is money concerned, children are used as really a commodity. And you have, of course, import countries and export countries in these circumstances. Australia would be an import country in these circumstances, and importing children from third world countries. So it is a concern, and we have to ask ourselves, really, are we approaching this from the right perspective? And I don't propose to go through my whole PowerPoint because it does talk in detail about the adoption process, but really the whole issue with this type of discussion today is, well, isn't there a better way? And if there's not a better way, there have to be appropriate remedies in place. And there does not appear to be remedies in places when things go wrong. The Hague Convention is a good convention, but I can recall many discussions with Barbara Connolly, who is the chair of the Family Law Committee of the IBA, who will be undertaking a similar seminar for the IBA on these adoptions when they go wrong. I mean, children can even lose their citizenship over it, their birth citizenship over it, if things go wrong. And there is a really big concern about the amount of money that is being made by these third-party agencies. I mean, it's also very similar to the tainted money argument that is used in relation to modern slavery. So I think these are issues, very important issues to take into account. And I must say, as I said before, it was an epiphany to actually hear David speak about these matters, because I never really looked at it from the point of view, I knew things went wrong, but whether in fact we should be doing this in the first place, should we not be looking at trying to assist families in third world countries to maintain the family unit? And if adoption is a last resort, should we be looking at trying to adopt within that ethnicity, and also keeping the family, the birth family, where possible, in touch with the adoptee? These are all factors, and I commend Lynelle for the work she's done, being an adoptee herself in these circumstances. So I think there is also one final thing I wanted to talk about. You know, there's a huge human rights issue here, or component, and we can have all the UN conventions, the rights of the child, Article 21. I mean, all these look very fine, but it's how they actually work out in the practice, and what really are the remedies if things go wrong, and are those remedies adequate in the circumstances?
I don't think we should be encouraging it, because good practice focuses on the individual needs of individual children. And the danger is having adoption-driven systems. I know this is coined internationally, but from my perspective, adoption is not a child protection mechanism. Child protection happens prior to adoption. It's the understanding what's going on, it's intervening, it's making sure a child's safe. Adoption is one of many possible placement options. And so we need to keep focused. This is how it used to be, focused on the individual child. we run into trouble adopting systems from overseas, for example, the UK system that has crept into certain states in Australia about you count adoptions by numbers. That tells us nothing about the success of adoption. And that becomes the goal. So we have to be very, very careful of adoption-driven system. And that doesn't mean we don't have adoption. We certainly do. But that's one of the issues that causes poor outcome measures, poor monitoring about whether the service is good or not. So and the reality is, if a child does not need to be separated from their family, that is a good thing. I think donors of the world need to redirect their attention. A lot of donors giving big money to developing countries are funding residential care, embracing adoption-driven ideologies, and churches are getting in there big time, particularly in the States. And so donors need to redirect to helping countries do tracing, family strengthening, those sort of measures.
Yes, I do. I would also like to highlight, though, a couple of things. So the first one is that, this is not just about poverty, because many of our first world countries, in intercountry adoption, they do include first world countries. So we have America, they send at least 100 children a year through intercountry adoption to other countries. You've got China, South Korea, they are first world economies. They're not poor. What this is about the lack of willpower, political willpower, to actually put children first and foremost and make sure that family preservation is a priority. Even in Australia, if you actually prioritise what is happening to our children, instead of putting adoption as a first solution, we should be jumping over hoops and putting all the money, 80% of that money should be funded towards helping the families who have born these children to actually be able to parent them. That is the best thing for children, not adopting them into a stranger home. I don't mind, and I support kinship adoption, family adoption. I think that's, that should be the first solution if biological parents can't actually raise their children themselves. But I think we forget too easily that it's too easy to go and adopt someone else's children and not look after your own backyard, when countries like America and Australia have a huge, huge background in not actually being able to provide adequately for our own children domestically.
Well, there's so much to say. So first of all, Lynelle's last point, we have over 100,000 children in our foster care system who have been cleared for domestic adoption. And so that goes to Lynelle's point of in our own backyard. And I want to follow up and talk about that, because that's a very different system from the intercountry adoption system. It doesn't have much money. It's always struggling to supply adequate services. So there is a funding issue that always goes with a domestic child welfare program. And I'm not saying America is the best or the worst as to that. The fact of the matter is, I do think there are a substantial number of children who cannot safely be raised in their family of origin within our own countries. I'm not talking about international adoption particularly, but just within the US, for example, which I know best. And the question of what you do about that, yes, family-based care is better than residential care for 9 out of 10 kids. There's some kids who have trouble adjusting after much trauma to a family environment, but for most kids, residential care is not a good long-term outcome at all. So yes, some form of family-based care like adoption is necessary within our own countries for our own populations. My concern there is, what does that look like? And I just totally disagree with the full severance model of adoption, with this pretending that the child dropped from the sky into the arms and home of the adoptive parent, no matter how necessary, no matter how helpful that adoption may be. So to me, there's real work to be done within our own countries with reconceptualizing adoption, even when it is very much needed. Second, I did want to come in somewhere and talk about The Hague, because I do work with them, that this is on tape. So I do want to be clear and say that in my mind, the Hague Treaty, as Anne said, is a good treaty. The folks who work for the Hague are wonderful and skilled. But what I was trying to point out is they're not regulators. They're a tiny group of people who create standards. And it's up to the countries to decide whether or not to do intercountry adoption. They're not bound to do it by signing the treaty, and to implement those Hague standards. And the fact of the matter is, although they're implemented on paper in the formal sense of having a central authority, I do not believe they are implemented as to this core notion of adoptability, that we couldn't find a solution for the child in their own country, okay? And I just don't think that's been done. Now, that's not the fault of the Hague people. That's the fault of our own countries individually. I want to also pick up on the comment about churches, because I am a religion and law scholar as well. I invested a lot of energy in interacting with the evangelical Christian community that had a strong orientation towards international adoption for about 10 or 15 years particularly. And again, well-intentioned, but destructively naive folks on a lot of issues. And I have to say, they've mostly switched their orientation. Now, the problem is that most of them have not said where we were wrong, although some have, I have to say. We were wrong and now we need to shift. They've simply silently shifted, to other emphases. And so the American evangelical community at the higher level is up to date on how intercountry adoption only affects a few kids and can go wrong. But on the ground, the people who heard sermon after sermon about how great in international, adoption is, haven't gotten the memo. So there's this lag, but there has been a learning process with the leadership. And frankly, what I said to them, look, if the whole purpose of these massive conferences is to do international adoption and help all these kids, and international adoption to the US is down 80% during the time that they've been actively promoting it, clearly, something's wrong here. You need to talk about other interventions for families and for kids. And they have learned that, and they were open to dialogue, I do have to say. And I had to go through a learning process. I was just as naive and dumb and ignorant as anybody about adoption, and I very much regret that. So I think we all have to be open to the learning processes. And it's been so hard. I mean, listening to Trish, listening to Lynelle, it's getting past this sentimental, and Anne as well, this sort of sentimental adoption is always wonderful. It's a wonderful charitable act. It's a wonderful solution. And understanding the loss, the trauma that goes with it, even in the best cases. And it's something that we really have to continually get out there, how difficult of a solution it is. As Anne said, a last resort, and then it needs to be done right. So I hope that answers. So yes, I very much agree with what Lynelle and Anne and Trish said, to sum it up. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. And I want to thank Lynelle and Tricia. And what I thought we might do is get some concluding comments from everyone. I think we need to do another session at a later point of time, because I think this is a platform to go forward. It's a complete reversal of the system we've got in place at the moment. If we could get a better system in place, and we could lobby government on this, I think it would be beneficial to all, because I found Lynelle's story very heartwarming. And it's the first time I've heard the story from an adoptee, which I think is a very important story to tell. It's like to hear it from a victim of modern slavery, to hear what they've been through, and it makes you look at things in a totally different way. And I think what has been a sort of a camouflage in this, everyone, if we look back in the 50s and the 60s, everyone thought, and the 70s, this is the right thing to do. This is the best thing for the child. Whereas in fact, it was probably the worst thing for the child. I'm not saying in some situations people were put in a much better economic background or have other opportunities, but there have been injustices done, and surely we have to learn from these errors. I remember the Irish book of the nuns in Ross Cray. I mean, Philomena's story, I thought was just overwhelming, and it was a true story. And this was all done in the name of religion. I'm a practicing Catholic. I make no bones about it, but, you know, absolutely shocked and horrified in hearing this woman's story.
Thank you so much for recognising the value of hearing from the lived experience. It's what my mission is, you know, these days, and what ICAV is all about is making sure that, you know, the lived experience voices are elevated. And one thing I guess I want to really highlight here is that we don't actually have a birth family member. And often it is the case that they are so unempowered that they live in situations where even if they try to get their children back, there is just no avenue for them to do so. And so I think we need to be very mindful when we have these kind of discussions that, yes, you finally have adult adoptees here to be able to say what our lived experience is, but I very much vouch for the fact that we need to get that further to the next step to actually hear from the families of loss, because their perspective is so unheard, and too often adoption is in the balance of too much hearing from adoptive parents' needs and desires and wants, and not enough from what's actually happening for birth families on the ground.
Yes, I don't know what the situation is in the States, but a lot of adoptions, once the legal process has gone through, they are irreversible.
That's right.
And I can remember having a discussion with Barbara Connolly on this particular issue, that, you know, unless you can find some technical issue in the actual technical legal issue in the adoption process, once the adoption has been legalized and gone through, it is very difficult to get it reversed. And decisions, irreversible decisions are made on people's lives, which I think does bear for a lot of consideration.
Just reinforcing really what David and Lynelle has said, but I think we need to be always critical and question, how do we know something, or why do we believe this, and actually always dig under that. And Australia is heading into dangerous ground in terms of welfare, and we're in an environment where all the services are being cut off, not all, but you know, things are being shaved, there's less for families. We know with number crunching, with the Spirit Level book, for example, that as inequality gets worse, social problems get worse. And when the services are not there to actually address those issues, and there's unrealistic timeframes, there's adoption-driven systems, that's when we get into trouble. So, for example, in the States, the children they send for adoption are African-American children. You know, we've had Aboriginal children in the early days adopted into Sweden and other countries. So there's so many issues, but we need to look at those structural factors as well as the desires of families, etc.
Well, I do want to mention just practically, you're connected and to the IBA, and I am urging them to have an adoptee representative at the meeting that they're organizing. I proposed Lynelle actually, and I hope that you will encourage Barbara to do that, because I cannot replicate Lynelle's voice or the voice of other you know, adoptees. You can't, you know. Trish can't. I mean, you've got to hear from the people themselves. And so if you would encourage the IBA to follow up in that direction, I would say as well, you mentioned being Catholic. I do think that what we've been talking about is very in line with the social doctrine of, you know, especially Pope Francis. You know, he just put out this encyclical about, you know, all of us as brothers and sisters, and what does it mean to treat each other that way, not in a market-based way. As you know, you were saying, I do think there's work to be done within churches, not in a There are bad histories to be dealt with, but there also are very positive things to say. The whole question is, how do these religious communities live out their social doctrine? And I think that adoption has confused religious communities because of, in the general cultures, not just religious communities, there's this sentimental teddy bears, lack of understanding of what it really is. And so it's a matter of the different groups figuring out what it means to live out these positive social ideals. And unfortunately, what that means for intercountry adoption is that even some of the best people can really get this badly, badly wrong if they don't hear the right voices, the right stories. And so, you know, that's a task that does need to go on and on and on, because it's so painful to even come forward with these painful stories because you're invisible. People don't believe that it's negative. They think you should be grateful. It's just so difficult to bring them forward. I will end where I began, which is, I think it's time to take a pause. I really do believe that. I don't say that lightly. Others said that before me. I'm not claiming to be first. I'm not claiming that it matters that I'm saying it, but for what it's worth, using my little voice, I think after these 70 years, we need to take a pause with this and we need to look at it more closely before we go on. That's where I'll end. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Really appreciate it.
We need to take a pause. It's time to take a pause. I was sort of already in the marketing mold when I had the paper prepared, but now I've changed my mind totally. And I see so many similarities with the modern slavery argument and the tainted money. So I think this is the next webinar has to happen, and it's time to take a pause. And as the co-chair of the Immigration Nationality Committee of the IBA, I will certainly put what influence I can so that Lynelle could be a speaker. Ultimately, the Family Law Committee is the lead committee on this, though. But certainly, I think Lynelle's voice should be heard.
And can I just add, sorry to interrupt you, but I'd just like to reinforce Lynelle's comment about mothers who've lost their children through adoption and fathers, that voice is even less heard than adoptees because of years of pain, really. And it's often said that these issues are in the past. We're not in the past anymore. It's still the present for those people. And I just wanted to say that.
Yes, well, the past is really now the present. It's so true. And if we don't deal with these issues now, in another 10 or 15 years, we're going to have massive issues. So now is the time to deal with it. And I think with those few words, we had a little bit of a shaky start with some technology, but this was the first time I've done it under my own platform, and I hope to do many more. And I want to thank all the speakers today. It's been absolutely wonderful to have you here.